This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. So President Trump got specific yesterday in his denunciation of hate groups present in Charlotte, including one member of one said hate group that is currently charged with murder.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
Meanwhile, in Durham, North Carolina, a hate group of a different sort was tearing down the statue of a Civil War soldier, a Confederate soldier, I should say. And you're going to hear from a delicate little flower with a Che Guevara T-shirt on.
Yeah, and she's the one who climbed the statue, put a rope around its neck, and then everybody in the crowd started pulling it down.
Right. So just so we understand.
Yeah, she had a
Che Guevara, right, which is a celebrated icon of the left, who was Fidel Castro's executioner. A totalitarian, a co-founder of the Castro regime in Cuba, murderous tyrant. So I don't know if she wants to plead ignorance or just wants to defend the legacy of Che Guevara or some combination of two. I'd be fascinated to talk to her. But here's what happened in Durham, North Carolina.
Stand up, fight back! Stand up, fight back! Stand up, fight back! Stand up, fight back!
The tactics that were used by the right were military in nature, and their acts were protected by the cops as they allowed the Nazis and the Klan to do their work. You've seen them target individuals who were unprotected. It was their goal. This was war for them. So what can you do and what is needed?
We're gonna squat up. What do you think? You want to squat up? Say squat up! Say squat up! Say squat up! Say squat up! No fascist USA! No cops! No KKK! No fascist USA! No cops! No KKK! No fascist USA! No cops! No KKK!
And then comes down the statue. Important couple things there. The woman with the Che Guevara T-shirt decrying military tactics. Also,
what they were chanting.
Failing to note, by the way, the ACLU of Virginia supported the constitutional right of those hate groups to march peacefully. And then lastly, of course, no cops, no KKK, no fascist USA. So understand, cops are the KKK. Yep. Cops are fascists. That's the perspective of Antifa and these other, bedwetters who have to be taken more seriously because they're not averse to violence either.
No, they're not. And they'll start with, that's vandalism, what they did. And nobody stopped them. Because I watched the whole video too, Dan, and police just stood there, didn't arrest them.
For more on these topics and others, including a piece he recently wrote calling on President Trump to fire Steve Bannon, we're pleased to be joined by David French, who's a writer at National Review, constitutional lawyer, a best-selling author, also a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So why don't we start with the statue issue? Your colleague Rich Lowry wrote a piece in National Review as well, suggesting, hey, look, you want to remove Confederate statues and monuments, put them in museums or something. That doesn't bother me, and it doesn't bother me either. I'm with him on that. Although the question is, where does this stop? Does the Washington Monument have to come down? Monticello, University of Virginia closed since that was founded by Thomas Jefferson. So how should we approach those who are leading the charge for the removal of these monuments and the political leadership of Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, assenting to their calls?
Yeah, I mean, one of my issues with the Take Down the Monuments call is what's the limiting principle here? Look, if a community votes to remove a statue that was erected in the 1920s, 30s, whatever, to commemorate a Confederate leader, I mean, that's the right of the community. But what a lot of people forget when they say, well, remove them to museums. Well, in the the South, in many ways, is an open-air museum. Large parts of the South are like open-air museums to the Civil War. The battlefields didn't happen indoors.
Yeah, right.
The battles happened all in the towns and the cities in the South and the countryside. And so, for example, I live just south of Franklin, Tennessee, where one of the most vicious battles of the entire war took place.
Nice.
And there's a statue of a Confederate soldier in the middle of the town, which happened to be exactly where part of the battle was. So, again, but one thing is very, very clear. We cannot allow roving mobs to determine where or if any given statue or memorial stands. And so, what happened there in Durham is already spreading like wildfire all over the left side of the web, or it's all over the web. And I would expect to see more of it. And we just can't allow mobs to decide how to determine how we remember the past.
But I feel like they're erasing history by taking down these monuments. I don't think that they should be moved into a museum. I think that they should remain where they are. But if that offends people, what if a baseball statue of, somebody like Ernie Banks or someone offends them? Are they just going to have the power to tear that down too? I just don't know where this is going to stop.
Well, exactly. That's what I meant. You can't allow the mob to decide this. That should be, regardless of where you stand on these monuments, that should be a basic rule, that this is going to be decided through a democratic process by the citizens of the community, not by a small mob wearing Che T-shirts. That can't be the rule. But again, I think a lot of what's happening here is the alt-right groups have used these monuments as a rallying cry, but removing the monuments is not in any way going to impact the alt-right. It's not going to hurt the alt-right. It's not going to impact it. And it's just a convenient place for them to gather. They'll find another place. And so, it's part of this urge that people have that says, I want to do something. I want to do something. And then we don't really think through what that something is and what are the implications of that something. And so I would use caution. But again, it's up to communities. It's up to the elected officials of communities acting, in accordance with the will of their citizens. But it definitely should not be up to the mob.
There's also a little bit of lack of distinction happening, of course, from D.C. Press Corps and other handmaidens of the left when it comes to drawing lines of demarcation between conservatives and so-called alt-right. Even between some on the alt-right and white supremacists, there's some that would suggest that I'm not an advocate for violence, I'm not a racist, but I have a problem with multiculturalism and the ravages of multiculturalism and other federal policies, other cultural directions this country is taking that pit races against one another, that give priorities to one race over another in acceptance to schools or jobs or whatever the case may be. We need to be careful about drawing those distinctions, don't we?
Yeah, well, and let me say this. If you're somebody who is against affirmative action, that doesn't make you in any way, shape, or form part of the alt-right. We have to be very careful about our terms. The alt-right is a belief system. It unites a whole bunch of different disparate groups, but essentially the belief system of the alt-right, what's going to pull them all together, is that race and culture are completely inseparable, and that Western civilization is white civilization. So that will include white nationalists, that includes white supremacists, but the alt-right at its very core is a movement that does not believe in racial equality, period. And so that's where we have to be really careful about defining our terms, and that's something where the alt-right, it is in the alt-right's interest to make that blurry. So it's actually persuaded, what's interesting, in large part because of the influence of Breitbart, it's actually persuaded a lot of people who are not alt-right that they are somehow connected with the alt-right or sympathetic to the alt-right because, say, they might be against affirmative action or they don't like identity politics.
Right.
The alt-right is identity politics squared. It is white identity politics. That's what it is. And so we have to be really careful about defining those terms because it is in their interest to blur that, because by blurring that, you get people more interested in who they are. You create a gateway into their movement. And that's, for example, what Milo Yiannopoulos did very effectively in 2016 through Breitbart was sort of blurring those lines and creating these gateways where an awful lot of people got interested in the alt-right who had ordinarily just shunned it completely, and that increased and that also had the effect of creating in the media a sense that the alt-right was bigger than it is. But the alt-right is a identity politics entity to its very core.
That's
identity politics.
That's an important definition, and it's one of those things too where we need to be specific in our denunciations as well as our definitions. And so, and be careful because, for example, Milo, he's a guilty pleasure when he's going after the left, and attacking the left in his, kind of spectacular ways. But you have to look past that and understand what he's advocating at the same time, and those are sometimes difficult connections to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that people have to realize is that the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. So if you see a YouTube, like, say, of Milo just taking down this angry feminist on campus, it's easy to think, oh, well, this guy, he's on my side. And then you read his very long apologetic article and introduction and establishment's guide to the alt-right he wrote in 2016, extremely influential, in which he essentially took the alt-right, whitewashed it, made it sound as if these people were really just kind of a bunch of merry online pranksters, when the reality is that they are deeply vicious and very, very race-obsessed. And that's kind of the irony of it, is that a lot of the surface appeal of the alt-right was to take on identity politics. But really, you weren't taking on identity politics in the alt-right. People who join the alt-right are identity politics. And that's something that, a lot of people who kind of follow these things casually had sympathies for the alt-right that were completely unjustified because they didn't actually know what they were sympathizing with.
Well, what's the alt-right's primary contribution to Trump's election?
Yeah, so the alt-right were, as an online movement, one of the things about the alt-right, nobody knows exactly how big it is. But one thing they do know is it punches well above its weight online. And so from early on, when Trump made, the famous rapist speech to launch his campaign, the alt-right jumped on the Trump train with both feet and viewed him as somebody who could facilitate some of their ideas. And their main contribution, if you could call it that, was relentless attacks online on anyone who criticized Trump. Their mission was to make life miserable for anybody online who criticized Trump. So that meant a wave of anti-Semitism, of racism, sometimes of outright threats. Like literally every single journalist I know who wrote on the conservative side of the aisle against Trump had some contact with the alt-right, every single one of them. And then others, it was just unbelievable. Like my friend Ben Shapiro had more anti-Semitic messages directed at him than any other journalist in the United States of America when he criticized Trump. And so that was one of the, wouldn't necessarily call that a contribution to Trump's election, but it was an absolute fact of life in 2016 that if you criticized Trump and you were a writer or you were a media figure, you were going to encounter the alt-right, and they were going to come after you to some degree.
But in your piece, National Review, where you call on Trump to fire Steve Bannon, and it's largely an argument about the alt-right and the presence in the West Wing, is there any evidence that Steve Bannon's influence has translated into, alt-right policy?
Well, we don't know. There's not a policy that Trump has as alt-right, but what Bannon did and what Bannon said, and he bragged about this in 2016, he said, Breitbart, the website, of course, that he was executive chairman of, he said, Breitbart is the platform for the alt-right. Alt-right leaders like Richard Spencer said that Breitbart was the gateway in many ways to the alt-right. When Bannon was there, he promoted as Breitbart's number one rock star Milo Yiannopoulos, who was the leading apologist for the alt-right. He also published things in Breitbart when under his leadership, Breitbart published a number of things that really were vicious attacks on Trump critics that echoed and used alt-right language and talking points. And then the Breitbart comment section was well known as almost like rivaling 4chan and Reddit as a gathering place for alt-right voices. And so what happened is Breitbart became this gateway to the alt-right. It became sort of the legitimizer of the alt-right. And then so when you have that person who then says he created the platform for the alt-right, and you put him in the Oval Office or near the Oval Office, and then someone says, well, this is just a fringe movement. This doesn't represent any constituency. Well, that's normally right whenever you're talking about these far-right extremist groups in a GOP administration. But this administration, you have the guy right down the hall from the president who says he created the platform for the alt-right. And so in that circumstance, it creates an awful lot of very legitimate concern for people. What is this guy's inner core? Is he just a vicious opportunist, or is he an actual, outright white identity politics guy? And then his conduct since he's been there. I mean, this attack that he's launched on H.R. McMaster is just beyond the pale. If you look, whenever Bannon strikes, the sewer of the internet opens up. It's like night following day, and we've seen that happen with his attacks on McMaster.
He is David French, constitutional lawyer and writer at National Review, nationalreview.com. David, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.